Human rights are fundamental. That means several things. It means that a just government legally recognizing human rights in most cases is a fairly straightforward and uncomplicated matter. Questions might arise about some human rights coming into conflict with other human rights, or how the rights might be instantiated in society, but these are seen as issues to be worked out. The granting of the rights, however, is non-negotiable. In a just society, possible complications are not seen as insuperable barriers to the granting of rights. Although those are rather elementary truths about rights and civics, they seem to be completely lost on a few YouTube users who either explicitly oppose the legalization of prostitution outright, or who keep raising objections and questions about the legalization of prostitution. Although I do not believe for 1 second that some of these YouTube video makers really doubt that a fundamental human right is involved in the question about legalizing prostitution, they act as though they don't get that a fundamental human right is involved in the question. Well then, let's clear up the rights matter right away. Notice that it only requires asking and answering one question to establish a person's right to engage in prostitution if they so choose. Here's the question. Who should own an adult's body? The state or the adult? Only sociopaths and those who love tyrannies will answer the state. And since we are mostly talking about women when we talk about prostitution, let's ask the question in the way that those who oppose legalizing prostitution don't like the question to be asked, because it reveals a bit too much about their tacit motives. Who should own a woman's body? The state or the woman? Those who oppose legalizing prostitution or who voice some discomfort about the prospect don't like to talk about the human right involved. They'd much rather talk about matters on the periphery of granting the right. They talk about human trafficking, the transmission of venereal diseases, men breaking their wedding vows, dirty Sanchez's, and glass-bottom boats, whatever those are. The opponents' more recent tactics involve discussions about the complications of the issue involved, and employing postmodern hackneyed thinking, preferring that issues resist closure and resolution. To give this matter some perspective, let's suppose that the right involved was not ownership of one's own body, but freedom of speech. Suppose that someone who didn't want to grant the right of freedom of speech, or someone whose so-called nuanced view gave them some reservations about granting the right, didn't carry on the discussions in terms of the right involved, but in terms of the problems that could result as a consequence of legally granting the right. Suppose all they talked about was the possibility of hate speech or civil unrest or hurt feelings that all could result from legally granting the right of freedom of speech. While acknowledging that some problems might have to be worked out, wouldn't we say, nevertheless, that problems and issues shouldn't be a barrier to granting this fundamental human right? Suppose someone else said they wanted to resist closure on the discussion about granting the right of free speech because they think it's somehow superior and more open to resist resolution on issues. Wouldn't we want to simply tell that person we don't care about their postmodern faddishness and air of superiority? That when it comes to a fundamental human right, discussions need to close and the rights need to be legally granted? Suppose that a third objector came along and proposed a kind of compromise view on the granting of freedom of speech, a view that they called the Swaydon model. Let's suppose that according to the Swaydon model, people could legally engage in free speech in publications and broadcasts, but no one else was legally allowed to read or listen to them. Wouldn't we think that this model was pernicious because it was obviously designed to render the right of free speech moot? Yes, those who love human rights would have precisely those reactions, and we wouldn't be inclined to take seriously the so-called arguments of those who want to either deny or render moot the right of free speech. We wouldn't take their laughable arguments seriously, not even for a second. Yet, we are supposed to take seriously those who effectively raise objections and create obstacles to a woman owning her own body? That's idiocy.